Today, we delve into a heartbreaking story of betrayal, desperation, and loss. It's a tale of how a well-respected English professor's life unravelled in the most tragic way, all because of misplaced trust and love. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. It was 2007 when I first met John. I was a young traveller, living out the adventure of a lifetime in Thailand. The country's exotic charm, vibrant street markets and breathtaking landscapes had lured me in, and I'd come to explore its football scene, attending the Asian Cup with a group of fellow Australians. Among the people I met was John, a seasoned English professor who had lived in Thailand for many years. He was in his mid-40s with a deep love for the Thai culture, and he had built a life there. His passion for teaching, his love for the students, and his affinity for the Thai people were apparent to everyone who came across him. He had been living in Bangkok for over a decade, and in many ways, he had adopted the city as his home. John's story was one of ambition and fulfillment. Before arriving in Thailand, he had been a respected professor in Australia with an innate desire to inspire young minds. However, he had always felt something was missing in his life. The promise of adventure and an enriching cultural experience led him to Thailand, where he quickly fell in love with its people, food, and bustling energy. He had always been a social person, making friends with both locals and fellow expats. Over the years, he had developed a tight-knit community of people who came to respect him both as a teacher and a friend. In many ways, John had built his life from the ground up in Bangkok. His small apartment was filled with books and mementos from his travels around the country, and his weekends often consisted of trips to local temples or casual strolls through the vibrant streets of Sukhumvit. He was also an active member of a local expat community, frequenting cafes and social spots where people from all over the world came to gather and exchange stories. But his life took an unexpected turn when he met Lilo as a young Thai woman, intelligent and strikingly beautiful, with long black hair that cascaded down her back like silk. She had a quiet charm, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of secrets she never spoke. John introduced me to her one day at our regular cafe, a cosy little place tucked away on a side street in Bangkok. She was a student of his, one of his brightest, and he often spoke highly of her. At first, Lei seemed like just another student who was eager to learn. She would meet with John regularly for English practice, engaging in deep conversations about everything from literature to Thai politics. I had seen her around the cafe several times, always quiet and polite, a perfect example of the eager and hard-working students that John admired so much. But something changed. About a year later, John called me up, his voice filled with an unusual excitement. He told me he was going to Hong Kong with Lei. At first, I didn't think much of it. It seemed like an innocent trip, a way for them to escape the stress of their everyday lives. But when I asked him about the details, John's demeanour shifted. He explained that Lei had come to him with a request. She wanted to go to Hong Kong, but she couldn't afford the trip. She had asked him to accompany her, and as a favour, he agreed. They were going to pretend they were married for the purpose of obtaining a visa. I was sceptical, of course. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. Why did she need him? Why didn't she just go on her own? John assured me it was nothing more than a simple favour for a student in need. She had mentioned something about her family's financial troubles, and John felt compelled to help, so the plan went ahead. Over the next few weeks, John and Lee rehearsed their story. They spent hours discussing the details, their shared memories, their favourite songs, the story of how they met. It felt like they were preparing for a role-playing game, one that involved pretending to be a married couple in front of immigration officials. John was confident that this was just a harmless favour. He was helping a student in need, and he would return home in a few days. The day they left for Hong Kong, I met John one last time at our regular cafe. He looked a little nervous, but he brushed it off with a laugh. "Don't worry," he said. "Everything will be fine." I told him to take care and that I'd see him next week for coffee. Little did I know, I would never see him the same way again. When John returned from Hong Kong a few days later, he seemed shaken, but not for the reasons I had expected. He told me that they had been questioned by authorities at both Bangkok and Hong Kong airports. The usual immigration questions: where they were going, how long they'd been married, what their plans were. He seemed unscathed by the questioning, but something was off. John confessed that there had been more to the story. Lou's family, he explained, was in financial ruin due to her brother's accident. The details were murky, but Lou's brother had been involved in a drunk driving accident that had resulted in a fatality. The family was now in debt, and Lou felt pressured to earn money any way she could. A friend had suggested she could earn money in Hong Kong, selling her body to the highest bidder. John didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but he assumed it was a desperate attempt to save her family from financial ruin. Lei had assured him this was her first time doing anything like this. At the time, John didn't know what to think, but he trusted Lei. He believed she was telling the truth. They had arrived in Hong Kong and things seemed fine at first. But when they went through customs, John was taken aback by a man who was waiting for them on the other side. This man, a Chinese national, took Lei away without a word to John. That was the last time he saw her. John's world shattered in that moment. Over the next several months, John was consumed by questions and confusion. He couldn't understand what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure. He had been caught in something far bigger than himself. Despite his efforts to get answers, he remained in the dark. Meanwhile, Lei had gone missing, and John found himself at the centre of a criminal investigation. It wasn't long before the police arrived at his doorstep. Interpol had issued a warrant for his arrest. He was charged with human trafficking. The accusation was baffling. He had never been involved in anything illegal, and the thought that he could be accused of such a crime felt surreal. But the charges were real. John was arrested and his world turned upside down. The legal proceedings were long and grueling. John's defence lawyer tried to argue that he had been duped, that he had been unknowingly involved in a human trafficking ring. But the evidence was damning. Lei's story, as it turned out, had been far more sinister than John could have imagined. She had been sold into a brothel in Hong Kong, and the authorities believed that John had played a role in her trafficking. The court hearings were intense. Each session was filled with tension and accusations. The prosecution painted John as a willing participant in a human trafficking scheme, while John's lawyer tried to convince the court of his innocence. But no matter how hard they tried, the case seemed hopeless. John's lack of financial resources worked against him. His lawyer claimed that if they had millions of baht, they might have been able to pay off the judges and secure a lesser sentence. But John had no such money, and his fate was sealed. When the verdict was finally delivered, I was in shock. John was sentenced to life in prison. Life. For something he never intended, for a crime he didn't commit. The court's decision felt like a nightmare come true, but the story didn't end there. Later that day, a young girl approached me in the courtroom. She introduced herself as Lou's younger sister. She spoke in broken English, her face filled with guilt and sorrow. She apologised for what had happened, explaining that Lou had been coerced by the triads. They had threatened her family, telling her that if she didn't comply, they would harm her parents and sisters. John had been set up from the start. He had no idea what was happening, and he had never intended to hurt anyone. But in the eyes of the law, it didn't matter. The damage had been done. I had to break the news to John. When I told him what Lei's sister had said, I saw his face drain of colour. He looked as if the life had been sucked out of him. He was defeated, broken. The months that followed were painful. John's health began to deteriorate. He grew increasingly despondent, and I could see him slipping away. He began using drugs to numb the pain of his existence, and he stopped caring about anything, even his teaching. He had once been a man full of passion, someone who loved helping others, but now he was a shadow of his former self. I continued visiting him in prison, but each time I saw him, he looked worse. The isolation, the hopelessness, the conditions at Klong Prem prison were taking their toll on him. The prison was a grim place. a far cry from the vibrant city he once called home. The smell of sweat and decay filled the air, and the walls were lined with bars that felt like they were closing in on him. There was little camaraderie among the inmates. Most kept to themselves, and John was no exception. He had no desire to connect with anyone anymore. 3 years into his sentence, I received a call from the embassy. John had died. He had overdosed in his cell. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I never imagined it would come to this. The man I had known, the man who had once been full of life, had been swallowed by a cruel and unjust system. John's death was a tragedy, but it was also a warning. His story was a reminder that sometimes life can take unexpected turns. What seemed like a simple favour for a student turned into a nightmare, and the consequences were far-reaching. The lesson is clear: if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is.